There's a silence that comes after death that no music can fill. It's not the sweet stillness of dawn or the comforting hush of falling snow, no. It's the kind that lingers like a presence, heavy and watchful. Every corner of the house holds a breath I didn't take. Every object stares back like it remembers something I've tried to forget. And on that pale Tuesday morning, the kind where even the birds seem unsure whether to sing, I found myself standing in front of his bookshelf, our bookshelf, after almost a year of avoiding it. It had always been his space, that little alcove in the corner of our living room. He'd stained the wood himself, dark mahogany that gleamed when the sun caught it just right. We'd built it during the summer of 1981, before the gray in his beard, before the children moved out, before silence became such a loud part of our lives. I remembered how the shelf was slightly uneven, how he insisted on measuring twice, but somehow still drilled once. I smiled at that, or maybe grimaced. The line between the two is blurred over time. I hadn't touched that shelf in months. The books had gathered dust like tombstones left unattended, their spines brittle, their pages curling at the edges. There was no reason for me to be cleaning it, really. No one was coming over. No one had come over in a while. But grief is strange. It tells you to scrub corners that haven't seen light in years, as if order might bring him back, as if tidiness could conjure the sound of his laugh. I reached for a cloth, the kind he used to call the good rags, though they were just cut-up t-shirts. As I gently wiped the top shelf, something shifted. A soft, sliding sound, barely noticeable, like a whisper against wood. It didn't sound like a falling bookmark or a piece of paper. It sounded significant, intentional. I leaned down slowly, knees aching as they always do when I forget I'm not 40 anymore. On the floor, nestled against the edge of the rug, was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed, delicate, the creases worn soft from time. I hesitated. It wasn't just a note, that much I could tell. It was an envelope. And on the front, in familiar penmanship, was a name. But not mine. That's when my heart skipped, not the romantic kind of skip, but the kind that reminds you your body is old and human and easily wounded. His handwriting. I would have known it anywhere. The way he curled his R's, the deliberate tilt of the M, like each letter was leaning in to listen. It was him. It was undeniably him. But the name was foreign, a woman's name. Not mine. Not anyone I knew. Elegant, almost poetic. A name that felt, whispered, not spoken. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. The paper crackled under my touch. I stood there for what felt like an entire season, unsure whether to open it or burn it. There are moments in life when we're given a choice we never asked for, to know the truth, or to remain in peace. I chose the truth, even as my peace began to fade. I sat down slowly on the old armchair, the one with the faded roses and the spring that always made a sound when he shifted in it. I half expected to hear it now, but it was just me, just the letter, just the unknown. The envelope had no stamp, no date. It wasn't mailed. It was meant to be hidden, or perhaps it was meant to be found. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet, filled with his handwriting. No salutation, no dear, just her name at the top, and then, him. All of him, laid bare in ink. I don't know what I expected when I unfolded that letter. Maybe some old insurance slip, or a shopping list from years ago that got tucked away absent-mindedly between the pages of a book. But this wasn't that. The handwriting was unmistakably his, every letter pressed down with intent, as if he knew the ink had to last longer than his voice. The first line made my heart stutter, not from pain at first, but from sheer disbelief. I never stopped loving you. 5 words. Quiet, unassuming. And yet they rearranged everything I believed about the man I had slept beside for over 40 years. My fingers trembled, and I had to blink several times before the words came into focus. It felt like looking through fog, not just on the paper, but in my own memory. I didn't recognize the version of him who wrote this. It was as if someone else had taken hold of his pen, someone more open, more raw, more vulnerable. The man I knew had always been careful with emotions. Not distant, not cruel, just measured. He showed his love through maintenance, keeping the heater running in the winter, remembering to fill the gas tank, never forgetting to carry the heavy groceries. He was a man of acts, not words. And yet here they were. Words. Beautiful ones. Hurting ones. Words he never said out loud. He wrote of a summer I didn't recall. A cabin near a lake. The way her no, my laughter echoed off the water. He wrote of watching me read, saying I turned pages like I was afraid of disturbing the story. Of a kiss beneath a tree so large it could have swallowed us whole. At first, I thought this was a letter to someone else. Someone before me. A hidden love from long ago. A secret he had taken to the grave. My stomach turned at the thought. I wanted to stop reading, but I couldn't. His voice was pulling me in, not his voice I remembered, but the one he'd kept locked away, buried under layers of silence and restraint. And then it shifted. He began to describe things only I could have known. The green scarf I wore on a chilly April morning. The bench in front of the red-doored chapel on 7th Street. You looked like spring that day, he wrote. Like someone who hadn't yet decided whether to stay or run. My breath caught. That was me. That was us from a time I had tried so hard to forget. Not because it was painful, but because it felt incomplete. I had forgiven him then. Or at least I'd said I did. After the falling out. After the long silence between us when I wasn't sure if we would find each other again. I remember how he asked me to meet him, how he didn't say why. We sat in silence for most of it. I wore that scarf because it was the only thing I had left that made me feel young. And now, decades later, he was still holding on to that memory. Still thinking of that moment of me, not as the woman he married, but as the girl he had nearly lost. My eyes blurred as I kept reading. He wrote of regrets, deep ones. The kind that settle into your bones and don't leave, not even in sleep. He said he wished he had been braver. That he had said more. That he hadn't let the years teach him how to be silent. I thought love meant consistency, he wrote. But I see now it also meant confession, and I gave you too little of both. My hands clenched around the paper. I wasn't angry. I was undone. He remembered the little things, the way I always turned my ring 3 times when I was nervous. The way I hummed out of tune when I thought no one was listening. The way I cried during commercials, but held it together at funerals. He had been watching. Even when I thought I was invisible. Even when I felt unseen in my own marriage. He had been storing these pieces of me like treasures he didn't know how to display. And when he didn't know how to tell me, he wrote them down. Tucked them away. Hid them between pages I would only find when the house was too quiet to bear. I don't know how long I sat there. The light had shifted by the time I looked up. The shadows in the room had grown softer, longer, like arms reaching to hold me. I clutched the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. My throat burned with unshed tears. I had so many questions. Why hadn't he given it to me? Why write it at all if he meant for it to stay hidden? But I didn't feel bitterness. Not then. Not in that moment. I felt seen. Fully, deeply seen. Maybe for the first time in years. It struck me, then, how little we really know about the people we love, even when we live beside them for a lifetime. There are whole worlds inside them we never enter, because we're too afraid to ask, or they're too afraid to speak. And sometimes, the only way they can let you in is through something fragile and quiet. A folded letter left behind like a breadcrumb in the forest of their inner life. This letter, this confession, wasn't meant to hurt me. I think he meant for it to heal me. To leave me with something softer than silence. And it did. That day, something inside me stirred. A warmth I hadn't felt in years. Not romantic love, no. But closure. Maybe even grace. I had spent so many years wondering if he loved me as deeply as I loved him. If the silence meant indifference. If I had faded into the background of his life like wallpaper, present, useful, but unnoticed. And now I knew. I had always been noticed. Maybe not praised. Maybe not adorned with words. But treasured in his own quiet way. He just didn't know how to say it until now, until it was too late. Or maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late at all. That night, I didn't sleep. Not a wink. I sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a shawl I hadn't worn in years. The one he used to say made me look like someone from a painting. The tea in my cup had long gone cold, but I kept holding it between my palms as if warmth might seep back into me through memory. The letter sat beside me like a living thing, folded neatly, silently pulsing with all the things he never said. And suddenly, I felt like I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for years, I'd just stopped listening to what lingered beneath the quiet. I thought about all the times we had passed each other in the house like two ships in familiar waters. Not avoiding each other, but not fully arriving either. I had learned to fill his silences with kindness, to not ask too many questions, to find joy in the little rhythms. But now I wondered, was I ever meant to ask? Was I supposed to break through his reserve, or had I given up too soon? He had loved me. That letter was proof. Not the kind of love you shout from rooftops, but the kind that carves itself into the grain of everyday things, the way he always remembered how I liked my eggs. The way he left the porch light on if I stayed out past dark. The way he never once forgot our anniversary, even if he never said the words, "I love you," out loud. I thought of our first apartment. Tiny, drafty, with mismatched curtains and a leak in the bathroom ceiling that sang to us in winter. But we had danced in that kitchen, barefoot, spinning slowly to music from a little radio on the shelf. He hadn't liked to dance, but he did it anyway. For me. Just like I had learned to laugh at his dry jokes. Just like I had waited for him to speak, even when words were hard. And then came the years when everything became about surviving bills, children, parents falling ill, careers not turning out the way we imagined. We didn't stop loving each other, but we stopped noticing. We became responsible, reliable, and somewhere along the way, the spark faded into habit, and habit into silence. But now I knew silence didn't mean absence. It just meant fear. Or pride. Or maybe love in its shyest form. I looked around the kitchen. Everything here held traces of us. The chipped mug from our trip to the mountains. The chair with the cushion he always flattened because he never sat still. The old calendar still stuck on his birthday month, even though he had been gone nearly 2 years. I had frozen time in here, afraid to disturb what remained. But tonight, I saw it differently. Not as a shrine, but as a love letter written in objects. A museum of the ordinary, and that, in its own way, was sacred. I reached for the letter again. My fingers traced his handwriting, careful and a little stiff, the way he always held pens like he wasn't sure he trusted them. I imagined him writing it. Late at night, maybe. Or early morning, before I woke. Did he hesitate over every word? Did he cry? I had never seen him cry, not once, not even when his brother died. But this letter was soaked in the kind of tenderness that only tears can soften. And then came the guilt. Not his. Mine. Because for all those years, I had quietly mourned the things he didn't give me, the grand declarations, the spontaneous getaways, the late-night heart-to-hearts I saw in movies. I had sometimes wondered if I had settled. If I had chosen stability over passion. If I had made peace with too little. But the letter made me see, I hadn't settled. I had been loved in a language I didn't always understand. And he had loved me in the only way he knew how, through presence. Through quiet devotion. Through a kind of fidelity that didn't need applause. I thought about the last few weeks before he passed. He had been so tired. So slow in his movements. But still, he fixed the back fence, even though I told him to leave it. He arranged my pills on the counter each morning without a word. He watched me as I read, thinking I didn't notice. I wonder now, did he know I would find the letter? Did he put that book there on purpose? That possibility clung to me like fog. Not sad, not even bittersweet. Just reverent. Like he had left behind one final act of grace. One final attempt to tell me, you mattered to me, even when I didn't know how to show it. At some point, I got up and walked to the hallway. His jacket still hung on the hook. I slipped my hand into the pocket, half expecting something else, a photo, a note. But all I found was an old train stub. He had taken a trip a few months before his last hospital stay. Said he needed to see something before it was too late. He never told me where he went. Maybe he had gone back to that bench he mentioned in the letter. Maybe he had sat there and remembered me, the younger me, the girl in the green scarf. Maybe he had whispered into the wind all the things he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. I pressed the jacket to my face. It no longer smelled like him. Just time. But that was enough. By morning, I had made a decision. I would write back. Not because I expected him to hear me, but because I needed to say it. To let the words live in the open. To give voice to all the things I, too, had hidden behind the rhythm of daily life. So I took a pen, the one he always used. I found an envelope. I dated it. And then I began. I always knew. Even when you didn't say it. I knew. I began to write as if I were speaking directly to his absence. The room was silent, but my mind was loud. Louder than it had been in years. Words flowed through my fingers with a kind of urgency I hadn't felt since I wrote my last letter to my mother the week she passed. But this was different. This wasn't about saying goodbye. This was about uncovering everything that had gone unsaid for over 4 decades. It was about folding silence into speech finally. I always knew, I wrote. Even when you didn't say it. I knew when you brought me tea without sugar the week I said I was cutting back. I knew when you turned off the porch light 5 minutes after I walked in the door. I knew in the way you never let me carry the groceries, even when your back hurt. The memories flooded in like rain hitting old glass, soft, relentless. I wrote about our first dog, Oscar, and how he cried the day we left him at the vet. You couldn't go in with me. You stood outside and smoked 2 cigarettes in a row, something you only did when you were afraid. I understood then that your silence wasn't indifference. It was protection of me, of your own vulnerability. I wrote about the night you stayed awake until 3 a.m. when our daughter missed curfew for the first time. You didn't scold her. You just sat in the armchair and asked if she was okay. Then you made her toast. She never forgot that. Neither did I. I wrote about the day your mother died. You didn't cry. You fixed the fence that afternoon. Not because it needed fixing, but because you needed something to hold that didn't fall apart in your hands. I understood that too. But I also wrote about the things I never said. The nights I turned away from you in bed not because I was tired, but because I didn't know how to ask for comfort. The years I resented how easily you slipped into silence, while I held conversations with ghosts just to feel less alone. The bitter arguments we never resolved, but tucked away like unpaid bills, knowing one day they'd come due. And then I wrote what I had never dared say, even to myself. That I had been lonely. That I had sometimes looked at couples holding hands in the park and wondered why we never did that. That I had wondered what it would feel like to be chosen again, not out of habit, but out of passion. And yet, I never left. Not because I was afraid. Not because I had nowhere to go. But because I believed in you. In us. In the way your silence made space for my words. In the way you folded your life around mine without trying to reshape me. I folded the letter slowly. My hands trembled. Not because I was sad, but because I was suddenly light. As if I had set something free that had been caught in my chest for too long. I sealed the envelope and placed it in the same book, The Old Man and the Sea, between the same pages where I had found yours. A letter for letter. You once said Hemingway was a master of saying everything in silence. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. After that, I stood up and walked to the garden. The air was crisp with the scent of coming rain. The wind had that soft pull of autumn, brushing past my cheeks like memory. I hadn't been in the garden for weeks. Not since the tomatoes overgrew their stakes and the lavender dried up. But now I wanted to see it again, not for what it had become, but for what it had meant. This was where we used to sit on Sunday mornings. You with your coffee, me with my journal. Sometimes we didn't speak for hours. And that had been enough. Until it wasn't. Until one day I realized we had stopped being curious about each other. We had grown side by side like trees, strong, weathered, but no longer reaching toward each other's light. And yet, here I was. Still standing. Still reaching. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took the book, with both letters inside, and placed it by my bedside. I turned on the small lamp you had always hated for being too dim for reading and opened to the first chapter. And I read, slowly, word by word, not for the story, but for the feeling of time looping back into itself. Like I was meeting you again. And this time, really listening. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house felt different. Not lighter, not darker, just more awake. As if the walls themselves had heard me. I walked past your jacket again, still hanging there. And this time, I didn't reach for it. I let it be. Because now, I didn't need a scent or a memory to feel you. I had your words. I had mine. And in between them, I had found something I thought was gone forever, understanding. Later that day, I wrote a second letter. Not to you. To myself. It began like this. Dear me. You didn't fail. You didn't miss your chance. You loved. And you were loved. Even in silence. And for the first time in years, I cried. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were the kind that come when you realize the story you thought had ended still has a few chapters left to write. I hadn't left town in over 3 years. After he passed, I became the kind of woman who only traveled as far as the grocery store or the pharmacy. Familiar places with short parking lots and silent aisles. There was comfort in the routine. Predictability had become a kind of safety. But after reading that letter, after writing my own, something inside shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like I woke up wanting to chase the sunrise or hike a mountain. No, it was simpler than that. I wanted to leave the house. For a day. For no reason at all. I packed a small bag with a sweater, a flask of tea, and a notebook. I didn't know where I was going, only that I didn't want to be still. The road hummed beneath the tires like an old lullaby. Familiar, yet distant. I passed places we used to go together, the bakery with the crooked sign, the hardware store where he'd get lost among screws and tools. They no longer hurt to see. They just were. Like stones in a stream, worn down by time. I ended up in a little town I hadn't visited in over 20 years. It sat by the river, quiet and almost forgotten. The kind of town where the same man has cut the same lawns for 3 decades, and every shop window has a handwritten sign. I parked near the used bookstore, a place I remembered from when our daughter was little. She'd spend hours in there, lying on the floor with a pile of fairy tales. I used to sit in the corner, thumbing through poetry books, pretending not to check the clock. I stepped inside. The bell over the door chimed high and sweet like a memory. The air smelled like old paper and something softer, like dried lavender. A young woman stood behind the counter, probably in her 30s, absorbed in a novel. She looked up, smiled briefly, then went back to her reading. I appreciated that. There was a peace in not being noticed too much. I wandered through the narrow aisles. My fingers traced the spines of books with names I hadn't heard in years. There were books I once owned, once lent out and never saw again. Books he had read aloud to me when I was sick. Books I had underlined furiously in my 20s, thinking I understood life. Now I knew I hadn't even begun. And then I saw it, a copy of Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. The same edition I'd given him on our 10th anniversary. He hadn't read it, of course. He was more of a nonfiction man. But he kept it on his desk for years. Said he liked the cover. I picked it up, opened it, and smiled. Inside, someone had underlined the words, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart." I hadn't known how badly I needed to read that until I saw it. I stood there for a while, the book pressed against my chest, and felt the warmth of something unspoken like forgiveness, but gentler, like grace. I bought the book. The girl behind the counter slipped it into a paper bag and said, "That's one of my favorites." I nodded. "Mine too," I whispered, though I had never really read it all the way through. Not back then. But I would know. I had the time. I had the heart for it. Outside, the sun had begun to dip. The river shimmered gold and silver. I found a bench near the edge of the water and sat down. The pages rustled in the breeze as I opened the book again. And then I wrote. Not in the notebook this time, but on the back page of Rilke. I wrote a note for whoever might find it someday. I am 68. I thought my life was over when he died. When I found the letter, I thought my past would swallow me. But instead, I learned that some things don't come to destroy us, they come to open us. If you're holding this book, may it carry you forward the way it carried me. I left it there on the bench, tucked between the slats of wood like a seed. Maybe someone would find it. Maybe not. But the act of leaving something behind, something honest and unpolished, it felt like healing. On the drive home, I didn't listen to music. I didn't need noise. My mind was busy, not with worry, but with stillness. A quiet kind of joy. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on. I hadn't set it to a timer. Maybe it was a glitch. Or maybe, and I allowed myself to believe it, maybe it was him. That night, I made myself a proper dinner for the first time in months. I lit a candle. I played that old jazz record he used to hate. And I laughed. Out loud. At nothing in particular. just because I could. Before bed, I picked up the letter again, not to reread it, just to hold it, to remember that the past, even when painful, has a place. But it doesn't have to be the place we live. I placed it in a wooden box along with my own letter. 2 stories folded into each other. Then I closed the lid and whispered, "Thank you." 2 days after I left the book on the bench, the phone rang. It was late morning. I was watering the fern by the kitchen window, the one that had somehow survived longer than any of my attempts at gardening. The ring startled me not because it was loud, but because it had become such a rare sound in this house. These days, most people text or send emails. When a phone rings now, it's either a scam or something important. I dried my hands on the towel, picked it up, and answered with a quiet hello. "Mrs. Langley?" A female voice, unsure, slightly hesitant. Young, maybe 30 or so. "Yes. I hope this isn't too strange. I'm sorry to call like this. My name is Eliza. I found something. A book." I stood still. "Letters to a young poet," she continued. It had a note in the back. "With your name." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had left that message without a name. Or so I thought. But I must have written it instinctively, out of habit, signing it like I did all my letters before I lost the habit of writing them. "Yes," I said, voice slow and careful. "I did leave that. On purpose." There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the shuffle of background noise, birds maybe, or the hum of traffic. "I read the whole thing," she said. "Your note. I don't know how to explain this. I'm 29. I just got out of a terrible relationship. 5 years together. I was sure he was the one. I gave up a lot to keep it going. Friends, family, even my job for a while. When it ended, I felt like I'd wasted my best years." I sank into the kitchen chair, holding the phone with both hands, not because I needed to, but because it felt like anchoring myself to the moment. "I was sitting on that bench," she continued, "and I found the book. Your words. I don't know. It was like a light came through the fog. I needed to know who you were." I smiled. Not because of pride. It wasn't that. It was wonder. That something as small as a sentence scribbled in the back of a book could ripple into someone else's life. "I'm glad it found you," I said. We spoke for almost an hour. She told me about her love of books, about how she had taken a train that morning on impulse, trying to get out of her own head, about how she used to read Roca in college, but hadn't picked up a poem in years, about how something in that line I underlined, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved," made her cry in public for the first time in months. I told her only a little. I didn't need to retell the whole story, the marriage, the silence, the letter tucked in a book on a high shelf. I only told her that healing doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it sneaks in through unexpected doors, a smell, a sentence, a stranger's voice. Before we hung up, she said something that stayed with me. "You know," she said, "I think you were writing to yourself just as much as to anyone else." She was right. That night, I thought of her, this young woman I'd never met, never touched, but who had read my words and felt less alone. And I realized something I hadn't fully understood until then. We're all connected by threads we never see. Invisible lines like the roots of trees underground, stretching from one life into another. Sometimes those threads are grief. Sometimes love. Sometimes memory. And sometimes rarely, but wondrously hope. The next morning, I took out a small box from the top shelf of my closet. Inside were letters I had written and never sent. To my daughter. To my younger self. Even one to my mother, written years after she passed. They were private, raw, half-formed. But I realized something. I had spent a lifetime tucking my voice away. Out of politeness. Out of habit. Out of fear that no one wanted to hear it. But maybe someone did. I spent the rest of the week sorting through those letters. Rewriting some. Burning others. And then, for the first time in decades, I bought a new journal. Not to document my life, but to leave something behind. Something that said, I was here. I felt things. I learned slowly, but I learned. And I want you to know that you're not alone in whatever you're going through, because I've been through something too. I didn't have children who would want to read it. My daughter, yes, but she was busy, her life far from mine. I wasn't doing this for legacy. I was doing it because words deserve a home. And maybe, just maybe, I deserved one too. A week later, Eliza and I met in person. It wasn't planned in any dramatic way, no grand invitation, no ceremonial lead-up. She sent me a simple message: "I'll be back at the park bench on Sunday. If you feel like fresh air." I hesitated, at first. It had been years since I'd said yes to a meeting that wasn't medical or obligatory. Most of my social interactions at this point were with the pharmacist, the bank teller, or the neighbor who only ever asked about my recycling bin. But something about the way she phrased it, no pressure, no assumptions, made it feel like the beginning of something quiet and sacred. Not a meeting between strangers, but a continuation of a sentence that had paused mid-thought. So I went. I arrived early, nervous like I hadn't been since I was 22 and about to meet my future in-laws. I wore my light blue cardigan, the one with the pearlescent buttons that I kept just in case something special happened. The sky was soft that morning, full of those low-hanging clouds that made everything look watercolor. When she approached, I recognized her instantly. Not because we'd met before, we hadn't. But because some people carry a kind of resonance. Like the feeling you get when you walk into a library that smells like your childhood, or hear a song you didn't know you missed. She had kind eyes. Not in that vague, overused way people say to sound kind themselves, but truly kind. The kind that listen. "I brought something," she said after we'd exchanged greetings. From her canvas tote bag, she pulled out letters to a young poet. The same one. Its corners now softer, the spine more creased. My handwriting still in the back, like a whisper frozen in ink. She opened to the page I'd marked. "This line," she said, pointing to it, "this is the one that undid me." I read it again. The only sadnesses that are dangerous and unhealthy are the ones that we carry around in public in order to drown them out with noise. We sat in silence for a long moment. Not because we didn't know what to say, but because some truths need to sit beside you a while before you speak again. Then she told me about her life. Not in the chronological, biography-style way, but through images. Fragments. A mother who worried too much. A man who once made her feel beautiful, then small. A city she moved to with hope and left with debt. Her dog, Benny, who got her through the worst of the heartbreak, and whose ashes she still hadn't scattered. I listened. Not as a mentor. Not as someone older with advice. But as someone who had felt invisible in her own life, and knew the value of simply being heard. At some point, she looked at me and said, "You're not what I imagined." I chuckled softly. "Let me guess. Older." "No," she smiled. "Stronger." That word caught me off guard. Strong was never how I saw myself. Enduring, yes. Polite always. But strength? That had always been reserved for people who made big, loud choices. Climbed mountains. Made speeches. Walked away from things. But here in her voice, I heard it as something else. Strength as presence. As survival. As showing up for a stranger on a Sunday morning when no one expected you to. "I want to ask you something," she said after a while, tentative. "Of course. What do you do when you realize your life didn't turn out the way you imagined, but you're still here? Still breathing? Still with so much time?" I paused. No one had asked me that. Not my daughter. Not my husband when he was alive. Not even myself, not in those exact words. I think I began slowly. That's when life actually begins. She blinked, confused. When the expectations fall away, when you're no longer beholden to anyone else's image of you, you finally get to choose. Not out of ambition, not out of rebellion, but out of truth. You get to rebuild from what's left, and surprisingly, what's left is often more than enough. She nodded, a tear forming in the corner of her eye. "You know," she said, "you should write a book." I laughed. "At 68? She grinned. "That's the best time. You've lived the chapters. Now you just need to write them down." I didn't answer, but the thought planted itself quietly like a seed. Before we parted ways, she pulled something else from her bag, a notebook, small and leather-bound. "I got this yesterday," she said, handing it to me. "It's blank." I thought, maybe you'd write something in it. Anything. A sentence. For me. I held it in my hands, its pages untouched. "All right," I said. But only if you promise to write something too. And leave it behind someday. For someone else. She smiled. Deal. We hugged. Briefly, the kind of hug that wasn't about comfort, but recognition. As I watched her walk away, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not grief. Not regret. But room. Room for more. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the final chapter had been written. I didn't start writing right away. That night, I sat in my kitchen with the notebook she had given me, its leather still stiff, the pages so clean they made my old hands hesitate. There was a reference to that first page. A silence. It stared back at me, waiting not just for a story, but for honesty. I'd spent so many years telling stories to others. My daughter, my husband, my friends, stories meant to comfort, to inspire, to make peace. But never once had I written one just for myself. I made tea. I straightened the napkin under the mug. I checked the window latch. I folded the corner of the tablecloth. I did everything except write, until I couldn't avoid it anymore. So I opened the notebook, held the pen like it might sting, and wrote the first line. I have been silent longer than I've been alive. It surprised me. I hadn't planned to write that. It just came like it had been waiting decades for a door to open. And once it did, the words didn't stop. They flowed in soft ink and long sentences. About the summer I turned 16 and cut my hair against my mother's wishes. About the boy I loved who went to war and never came back. About the way I smiled in family photos when I was barely holding it together. About the kitchen floor where I sat crying after I miscarried the child we never told anyone about. About the dreams I shelved, travel, painting, learning Italian to make space for someone else's comfort. I wrote for hours. I wrote until the tea turned cold, until the street outside was lit only by distant porch lamps, until my eyes stung and my wrist ached and my breath came easier. Each page held a version of me I had forgotten. Not because she wasn't real, but because no one had ever asked her to speak. By the end of that week, the notebook was half filled. Eliza and I met again and again, always on Sundays. Sometimes at the park bench, sometimes in the little used bookstore tucked behind the forest, where the scent of old paper mixed with eucalyptus and damp wood. We rarely planned anything. We just showed up, two women, decades apart, but with mirrored souls. She wrote too. About her fear of turning 30 and still not knowing who she was. About how love felt different when you stopped trying to earn it. About the time she stood in front of a painting in a museum for 2 hours, not because she understood it, but because it made her feel seen. We would read passages to each other, then sit in silence, letting the weight of truth hang between us. Sometimes we cried. More often, we laughed, not loud or careless, but with the kind of laughter that says, "Me too." Then came the question. We were sitting by the duck pond, watching the late autumn leaves fall in slow spirals, when she turned to me and asked, "Would you ever share this? Like, with others?" I paused. "You mean publish it?" She nodded. The thought startled me. Not because I hadn't imagined it, but because I had. Quietly, in the privacy of my mind, I had begun to wonder if my story, stitched together with fragments, silences, and resilience, might mean something beyond me. "I don't know," I said. "Who would read a story about an old woman looking back?" Eliza looked at me, eyes steady. "Everyone. Because they're not just reading about your past. They're reading about their own future." That sentence stayed with me. Later that night, I opened the notebook again. I looked at all I had written, not polished, not perfect, but real. And I realized something. This wasn't just a record. It was a legacy. A way to leave behind something more than recipes and family photos. It was me in full, in truth, in my own handwriting. I started typing it all up. Slowly. Letter by letter. Some nights I only managed a paragraph. Other nights I wrote until dawn. I didn't try to sound young or clever or literary. I just wrote like I spoke. Like I remembered. Like I felt. Then one day I printed the pages. Found them in a simple folder. And on the first page I wrote, "To my daughter. So you'll know me. Not just the mother, but the woman." I mailed it to her without a note. Just the manuscript. Just the truth. I didn't expect a response. Our conversations had been sparse for years, polite but distant. She lived far away, had her own life, her own children. I understood. I didn't resent it. But still, my hands trembled when I dropped the envelope into the mailbox. 3 days later, she called. Her voice cracked before she said hello. Mom? I never knew like this. We spoke for hours. She asked questions I never thought she cared to ask. About the choices I made. About the feelings I hid. About the person I had been before I became Mom. Something shifted between us that night. Not a repair, but a beginning. And it all started with a letter I hadn't meant to find, tucked in a book I almost gave away. I never imagined that telling my truth quietly from my kitchen table could reach anyone beyond the 4 walls I'd spent decades tending to. But that manuscript, the one I sent to my daughter, became more than a letter. It became a key to a door I didn't even know had been locked between us. The week after our call, she sent me a package. Inside was a printed copy of my story, beautifully bound, with a soft cream cover and gold lettering that simply read, her name was Margaret. My name. Tucked inside was a card. I showed this to a friend of mine who works in publishing. She cried. She wants to help you share it. I held the card in my lap for a long time. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet awe that comes when life dares to open up again. I thought back to the woman I was a few weeks earlier, knees stiff, dusting forgotten books, convinced her voice no longer mattered. And now here I was, holding proof that even at 68, beginnings still happened. That maybe the world wasn't finished with me yet. At first, I was hesitant. The idea of strangers reading about my miscarried child, my silenced disappointments, the loneliness inside a long marriage, it felt too vulnerable, too raw. But Eliza reminded me, you've already lived it. You survived it. Now let others feel less alone because of it. So I agreed. I spoke to an editor. We made small changes, cleaned up the grammar, clarified some dates. But the heart of the story? Untouched. They kept the crooked edges, the pauses, the moments I almost gave up on the sentence. Because those, they said, were the soul. 3 months later, the book was released quietly, online at first. I didn't expect much, but people found it. Emails started arriving. From women in their 40s, 50s, 70s, women I'd never met, thanking me for saying what they never had the words for. One woman wrote, I've never told anyone I lost a baby, not even my husband. But after reading your chapter, I finally did. Another wrote, I thought it was too late to become anything more than a wife. You helped me remember I was someone long before that. And still another, I gave my daughter your book. We're having our first real conversation in years. I sat in my chair, staring at my inbox, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. This wasn't fame. It wasn't fortune. But it was healing. Not just for me, but for others. A ripple I didn't mean to start, but that moved gently through the lives of women who had learned, like me, how to disappear quietly. And now, how to return. Then came the interview requests. A podcast here, a magazine there. At first, I declined. I didn't see myself as someone with wisdom or insight. But the publisher insisted, just speak like you wrote. Honestly. So I did. On a cold February morning, I sat at my kitchen table, same one I'd written the first sentence on, and spoke into a headset. I told my story again, not perfectly, but truly. I spoke of finding the letter, of meeting Eliza, of the rediscovery not of who I could become, but who I'd always been. The podcast episode went viral. Thousands of listens. More emails. More stories. And one message in particular from a woman named Annette stayed with me. She wrote, I just turned 70. My husband passed 2 years ago. I didn't think I had any more pages left. But after hearing you, I bought a notebook. She ended with, tonight, I'm writing page 1. That's when I knew. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about all of us. All the women who had loved in silence, grieved in silence, sacrificed in silence, survived in silence, and who were now ready to speak. So I started a group, a weekly gathering in the community center library. I called it Late Bloomers. We met every Thursday. At first it was 5 of us, then 10, then more. We sat in a circle. We brought stories, photographs, unfinished poems, old dreams, letters never sent. Some read, some just listened. But we were there, present, open, blooming again. One week, Eliza came. She stood up, shaky but brave, and read a piece about her grandmother. When she finished, the room was silent, but not empty. It was full of breath, of memory, of warmth. Afterwards, she hugged me. "You gave me my voice," she whispered. I shook my head. "No. You always had it. I just reminded you it was still yours." As I walked home that night, under the fading spring light, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not pride, not even joy. Peace. The kind that comes not from things being perfect, but from knowing they're honest, whole, enough. And it all started with a letter, hidden in a book I almost never opened. They say the past never really leaves us, it just changes form. I used to believe that was a haunting thing. That memories clung to our shadows like dust to old photographs, always coloring the present with regret. But now, sitting in my sunlit kitchen, sipping tea from the mug Eliza made me, the one that says, "There's always time for page one," I think maybe the past isn't here to weigh us down. Maybe it's here to remind us how far we've come. A year has passed since I found that letter. A year since my hands trembled over unfamiliar handwriting, since my voice cracked open after decades of being soft, careful, edited. And in this year, I've lived more freely than I did in the 40 before it. I speak differently now. Slower, but stronger. Not to dominate conversations, but to inhabit them. I take pauses not out of fear, but because I know my words deserve space. I used to fear being forgotten, ignored, dismissed as just an old woman with stories. But stories are what we leave behind when the rest fades. They're what remain when photos curl and names are misplaced. And mine now live in the hearts of women who no longer feel alone in their grief, in their longings, in their silent courage. Eliza visits more often now. She doesn't always bring flowers, sometimes it's just her laundry and a tired smile. But she brings herself wholly, without pretense. We sit and talk about things we used to tiptoe around. Love, loss, anger, resentment, forgiveness. There was one afternoon, not long ago, when she asked me, "Do you ever wish you could go back? Change how it all unfolded?" I've thought about it. Truly. I used to, I said. I used to lie awake and rewrite conversations, reactions, entire years. But now? No. Not because it was easy or fair, but because even in the silence, I was growing, even in the ache. I was learning how to love better. She nodded slowly, like she was hearing the words not just with her ears, but with something deeper, maybe the part of us that still remembers what it felt like to be mothered without words, only gestures. I no longer look for validation in mirrors or approval in empty chairs. I dress how I please, I walk slowly through bookstores, I strike up conversations with strangers, not to fill silence, but to honor it. And once a month, I receive a letter, handwritten from a woman somewhere in the world who read my story and decided to write her own. Some are short, some are messy, some are devastating. All of them are beautiful. All of them are brave. Last week, I returned to that book, The Old Man and the Sea. It still sat where I'd left it. Still smelled faintly of dust and thyme. I picked it up and finally read it cover to cover. The ending, it didn't surprise me. It moved me. Because it wasn't about defeat. It was about dignity. About resilience. About choosing to show up even when the waves have taken everything. When I closed the book, I whispered, "I understand now." Not just to the story, but to myself. To the girl I used to be. To the woman I became. To the parts of me that once felt too late, too broken, too invisible. There's a power in rebuilding, not to reclaim what was, but to discover what still can be. At 68, I didn't just rediscover my voice. I reclaimed my place in the narrative. No longer a background character in someone else's life. No longer the wife, the mother, the quiet helper with folded hands. I became the author. And as I sit here, writing the last page of this chapter, I realize something both simple and profound. There is no expiration date on becoming whole. No limit to how many times you can begin again. No age at which you must stop blooming. And if one forgotten letter, hidden in an old book, could open the door to all of this. Imagine what else might be waiting quietly, patiently for us to notice. Sometimes, the life we were meant to live is still there, just hidden between the pages.